Hey folks, welcome back. This video is going to be a breakdown of the Dragonflight Professions from the viewpoint of a raider or a raid leader with personal or team progression in mind, and will hopefully help you wrap your heads around the changes to professions in a quick and condensed format, as let's face it, as raiders, we don't exactly have the greatest attention span when it comes to things like tutorials. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the first chapter. There will be timestamps below, so feel free to ping and choose as and when. So, starting with the beginner section, essentially, touching on the basics for those of you that haven't really touched on professions much or have just stayed well clear of it. There's been a huge overhaul on the profession system, with the introduction of crafting gear, crafting stats, the return of crafting specializations, just to name a few. So let's condense it all down into bite-sized chunks and take it from there. So the first major change is the introduction of crafting gear and crafting stat introduction, with both crafting and gathering having a set of stats to aid in improving them, both crafting quality, resource management, resource acquisition, and generally crafting speed, with the chance to proc better gear or better consumables in the form of inspiration. Now, from a personal crafting perspective, inspiration is going to be your big main takeaway if you're crafting gear, because it's a chance to craft higher item level stuff through quality, which we'll discuss in a moment. Or if you're crafting consumables, you're going to want multi-craft, because then you've got a chance to craft more. From a raid leader's perspective though, and if you're managing raid materials or raid funds, then you're probably going to want to care about resourcefulness, which allows for you to essentially keep some of the materials back. So if something costs 5 herb of something along with a vial, you might actually only need to spend, say, 4 herbs, or maybe even 3, which on a large scale definitely helps with guild funds. Now, discussing quality itself, this doesn't just apply to crafted gear and consumables itself, it also quantifies the reagents as well. So reagents come in qualities as well, with the goal of obviously the better quality you put in, the better quality you get out. But as you have dedicated crafters and people that play the profession game, there will eventually be the aim to get out the same quality, like 5-star quality stuff, while still putting in 1 quality star herbs and the poorest quality gems or materials or the like in it. Following on from that, and crafters, we also have the implementation of crafting orders, which sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's essentially a auction house for crafters where you can give up not just a financial commission in the form of gold, you can also give up your materials. So if you've collected a load of ore, if you've collected raid materials while raiding, you can either internally, through the working or crafting orders within the guild, you can transfer that to your blacksmith, your alchemist, and have something created from it, or you can do it externally. So just think of it essentially as a in and out of guild auction house for crafting purposes. We then have the addition of what's known as embellished crafting gear. So you have 2 forms of crafting gear, normal and embellished. Embellished has the unique equipped 2 attachment to it, which essentially means you can only have 2 embellished bits of gear equipped at any given time, much like the WOD system for the older players among us. Another key note as well from a profession perspective is profession recipes are rep gated. So very, very early on, what this means is getting them isn't going to be a problem guild-wide. It just means that you may need to invest in contracts, missives, and things like that through inscription, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, and maximize your gain early on. End game wise, especially as the expansion progresses, this is going to be less and less of a problem. But it's definitely something to bear in mind at the very start. You're not going to be able to have a legion of alts making you everything you want if you're a self-sufficient player, or were hoping to be in the upcoming expansion. So, breaking down the professions then. Chapter 2, let's get to the meat and potatoes of it all. This section, I am going to talk about the specializations in a general sense for each profession, and we'll then discuss the priorities from a raid and personal player perspective in the final chapter. So, starting with Alchemy then. Alchemy's 3 profession specs are Potion Mastery, Vial Mastery, and Alchemical Solutions. Now, Potion Mastery is, as you'd expect, it's a focus on potions, but is also the path for the creation of raid cauldrons. Vial Mastery is the emphasis on vials, as you'd expect, but do remember that this time around we don't have traditional flasks like we had in Shadowlands. We instead have vials, and they are 30-minute duration, so Vial Mastery, increasing their durations and their potency, is kind of a more cost-effective solution long-term if you're playing as a personal player. Alchemical Solutions, though, is just general crafting increases to all alchemical recipes that you may have, so multi-craft, inspiration, and it kind of buffs your crafting stats. Moving on to Inscription. You have Inscription's 3 options of Rune Binding, Archiving, and Rune Mastery. Rune Binding improves the weapons, codexes, and Vantus runes that you can create. Rune Mastery is your general crafting increases, and Archiving, which is probably the most important one for Inscription, is access to your Darkmoon decks. And the Darkmoon Mysteries subspec within Archiving is your gateway into your Darkmoon decks. And within Archiving itself, you also have the access to create the contracts and missives that you and other guildies are going to need early on for the rep bonuses if you want to get all these recipes. Enchanting, again, is the last of the crafting specializations with 3 subspecs: Enchantment, Incitement of the Blue, Rods, Runes, and Ruses. Enchantment is the gateway subspec to learn more powerful weapon enchantments, both weapon and armor, with the effectiveness of these more powerful ones being roughly in the region of 30 to 50% at the moment on the beta. Remember, these numbers are subject to change, but you get the idea. These are essentially your epic enchants. Insight of the Blue improves your material gain from disenchanting and looting in the open world. So this just means that if you go Insight in the Blue, you're going to get more materials throughout the course of enchanting. Probably the route to go if you're playing alt enchanter, or you're leveling with the purpose of disenchanting all the gear as you go through the leveling process. Rods, Runes, and Ruses, general crafting gains and improved wand creation, because wands are a thing again. So weapon creation essentially for enchanters is improved through Rods, Runes, and Ruses. Now, Engineering, another one of the big ones. This is where we start getting into the professions that have 4 options per profession, essentially, in terms of their spec. You have Optimized Efficiency, which, as the name suggests, is improved to all your crafting gains. This is where you'll get all your crafting stats. You then have Explosives, which improve your bombs and allows for the better creation of non-engineer based bombs. So these are your easy throw stuff that you can throw around and just have some fun with. Function over Form is the engineer gear focused section. So it covers your goggles, your guns, a chance to craft epic bracers, which can then be augmented with cogwheels, which are engineer gems, essentially. And then you have, finally, Mechanical Mind. Now, Mechanical Mind is the one that's probably got the most coverage, especially on things like Wowhead, because it's responsible for the learning of Savior, which is the raid wipe prevention tool in the form of a failure detection pylon. Basically, you place this down before everybody dies, and then you get a reses out afterwards as a result of it. So beneficial if you've got warlocks that forget to soulstone, for example. Moving on to blacksmithing. You have armor smithing, which does exactly what it says on the tin. You specialize in making armor. Early on, you'll be able to specialize into one piece of armor. So chest piece, for instance, and it'll reward you a epic recipe as a result for that. In the term of blacksmithing, it's a molten. And then over time, you'll be able to specialize more and more into other armor sets as you branch out. Weaponsmithing does the exact same thing, just for the weapons. So you've got short blades, long blades, so your swords, your fist weapons, your glaives, your scythes, your pickaxes, your whatever else. You've then got specialty smithing, which improves the crafting for non-combat based crafts. This is anything that doesn't fall into armor or weaponsmithing. And then finally you have hammer control, which is just flat crafting skill gain across the entire profession. Jewel crafting, again, jewel crafter's toolset mastery, or jeweler's toolset mastery, sorry. That's your crafting skills one. Don't really need to say too much on it. Faceting is your epic gems and increases their family gems. And by family gems, they are split into earth, air, fire, and water, with each elemental spec, essentially, or elemental gem type, focusing on haste, crit, mastery, or verse. And by going into faceting, you'll get increased gems. Only thing is, at the moment, we don't necessarily know how many gems people are getting, which, from a rating perspective, is going to make this next specialization considerably more important, which is setting. This one allows for your necks and rings, but also allows for the creation of a miscellaneous consumable that allows anyone, regardless whether they're a jewel crafter or not, to socket their neck, or rather apply a socket to their neck. And the better quality this miscellaneous item is, the more sockets you can apply to your neck piece, up to a maximum of 3 as things currently stand. So definitely going to be a popular choice. Finally, you then also have enterprising, which is your crafting gains for reagents and other items used by other professions. So glassware, crystal hoards, things like that. Moving on to the final two then, you have leatherworking, which breaks down into your leather armor crafting, your chain armor crafting, both pretty much do what they say on the tin, specialize in either your mail crafts or your leather crafts. You then have primordial leatherworking, which covers special gear that doesn't necessarily fit into those two. So your embellished crafts, your bow, you can create an offhand tome, and also allows for the creation of a finishing reagent that allows physical strikes to have a chance to strike again for extra damage, which might be interesting depending on how that's tuned. Finally, you also have leatherworking discipline, which is just your flat crafting gains across the entire specialization. Moving on to tailoring then. Tailoring mastery is your crafting gains and cloth acquisition from humanoids. There is a subspec within tailoring mastery that massively increases the acquisition of cloth through increasing cloth drop on humanoids. Textile is crafting gains related to your trade reagents, so making your bolts of cloth, your disassembling of cloth to find elemental materials, and other profession tools or reagents such as polishing cloths. We then move on to draconic needlework, which teaches the creation of chronocloth or azure weave and their related gear sets. This is a thing like mooncloth, fellcloth, spellweave, and their ilk. This does pose a bit of a problem, and I'll discuss why when we get into the next section talking about the raid priorities. But draconic needlework is definitely going to be something a lot of tailors pick, because the final one is garment crafting, which is the tailoring's dedicated version of armor smithing. Now, you'll notice that I've not touched on the gathering professions, and the reason for this is because we're looking at this from a raider's perspective or a raid leader's perspective. So you're looking at kind of the crafting, the gear, the more end game parts of it, whereas gathering professions themselves are either going to be done while you're leveling, you're going to have your alts doing it, and because of the changes to the auction house, the region essentially for trade goods is going to be swamped. So I didn't really think talking about the acquisition and how the gathering professions get augmented was necessarily relevant to you guys in terms of how do I get powerful quickly. Now, going into the raid versus the player route. When I talk about the raid route, this is if your raid leader plans to assign certain crafters. You may have an officer in the guild that is going to hardline alchemy for the cauldron, or you may need someone that is a dedicated feast maker. And you'll notice I use those two as examples because they are the two main priorities. You're going to want cauldrons, The change to alchemy and the change to the fact that we're now using vials rather than flasks mean that the new raid cauldrons are instead actually giving out potions. Now, the potion that it gives out is the Potion of Ultimate Power, which is a flat primary stat gain for either 30 or 45 seconds based on the level of cauldron. And for those of you that played in Legion, you'll remember that the Prolonged Power was a ridiculously popular and ridiculously common potion, and having this in cauldron format is going to be huge and is likely to be the most powerful. So having a alchemist dedicated through the potion mastery, 10 points in potion mastery, and then moving down into batch production is going to be the best call. Cooking, on the other hand, doesn't have specializations. What it has instead is a caveat to its crafts so that your cooking skill improves how many of a thing you craft with the same materials. So the exact wording is the number of feasts per craft depends on cooking skill, which means that someone with 25 cooking skill trying to make a feast is going to make maybe 2 or 3 feast per reagent amount, whereas someone with 100 cooking may make 10 per the same material, which from a raiding perspective is huge because it's going to save a lot of gold. And let's face it, especially during progression early on, everyone goes through a lot of feasts. The third priority for raiders will be having an engineer that can get Mechanical Mind maxed in order to unlock Savior and having that wipe recovery tool. This is more for a speed thing, or if you're not running combat reses for any given reason, say the Warlock can't make raid, or you don't have Druids in your roster. But for a whole, you'll be looking at engineering. You then have the next couple of options. I say a couple, there's a few here that kind of all line up as would be nice. You have jewel crafting, inscription, enchanting, and tailoring, or the other armor creation pieces as the final slot. Tailoring ranks a little bit higher, but we'll get to that in a moment. You have jewel crafting because you may want someone to access the socket or the setting in order to socket necks as quickly as possible. This would allow the guild to have the ability, if a neck drops in raid or someone acquires a new neck, you can very, very quickly deck it out with what they need, and it's a bonus to the raid. Alternatively, you may actually just want either the necks or rings for the high stat jewelry to be freely available early on, because let's face it, getting rings to drop of the right stats is an absolute pain. Everyone knows that challenge, especially if you're playing Season 4 at the moment and you're still waiting on the Mechagon rings. You then have Inscription. Inscription ranks because from a raid perspective, you're probably going to want access to the contracts and missives very, very quickly so that everyone can get the recipes they need for further development and advancement through the professions themselves. Alternatively, if you don't want to get the rep, or you don't think that the rep is particularly important, you do have the option to go for Darkmoon Mysteries within the archiving tree and getting the Darkmoon decks quickly, because again, Darkmoon decks historically have always been very, very powerful trinkets early on. You've then got Enchanting. This is entirely up to the raid leader or the enchanter to have a discussion. You may actually have multiple enchanters within your raid roster, at which point you can divvy up the choice between either getting extra materials, like if you're disenchanting stuff. This is probably more likely to be seen in terms of farming situations, but it could be a case of just you want everyone to have a lot of enchants early on, because we don't know what the economy is going to be like, versus having one powerful singular enchant early on, like the Titanic weapon enchant the enchanters can have, which is plus 800 primary stat on a proc whenever you attack or deal damage or heal or any of your abilities, I believe the tooltip says, which is huge. That's just 800 free stat as you go through and just playing about the game. And then finally, we obviously have the tailoring and other armor crafting professions. Tailoring ranks higher due to draconic needlework. Now, the Chronocloth or Azure weaving gear sets that it can create, and I do say gear sets because it is a 2-piece set out of, so it is equipping 2 out of the 3 pieces gives you a set bonus. Chronocloth is your DPS set in that you store up a buff, and then once you hit 15 stacks of that buff, it's released and you generate haste, or you are granted haste for a period of time. Whereas the Azure Weaving, your abilities have a chance to heal other things and so forth. So that might be more on your priests and just general survivability of your clothies, potentially. Don't know, we need to see on tuning. But given the fact that you can have one on a tier piece, so gloves, and then the other piece is a non-tier piece, if it's looking like warlocks and mages and priests are all really, really strong and you want them in the raid roster, Draconic Needlework is definitely going to have a lot more of an impact, especially in terms of the Chronocloth and the haste granting to your warlocks, your mages, your shadow priests, because we're going to want that stat early. And if we can have one off piece and one on tier piece, it means that we can get the rest of our tier bonus through all the other pieces. So that is huge. Whereas alternatively, if you have a really heavy melee roster, you might actually want blacksmithing for weaponsmithing and get daggers and swords and things like that sorted for the majority of your roster, along with everything else. Alternatively, going on to the solo player side of things are a lot more opened up, or from a non-raid assigned crafter. And the reason for this is because this priority becomes down to what you as the player want to take from your game. Do you want to save money? Do you want to generate a little bit of money on the side? Or do you want to fill up hard to achieve or hard to get bits of gear, whether it be your neck, your rings, like from jewel crafting, your alchemy stone from alchemy. If you go into potion mastery and max out potion mastery, you learn how to make the second of the 2 alchemist stones. One of them is given to you baseline through leveling, which primarily focuses on vial augmentation. It's a sustaining one, so you do damage, and it basically increases the duration of your vial, which in turn will save you money. However, the one from maxing out potion mastery not only gives you a haste stat stick, but also means that when you use the potions of power, the ones that give primary stat, while the trinket's equipped, it will also give you plus 50 primary stat on top of that. So you're looking at, say, upwards of 700 primary stat by having this equipped, and then you're using used potion. Huge stat bonus. Alternatively, you may want to shore up your gear through blacksmithing, leatherworking, tailoring. Especially if you're a clothy, tailoring might actually be really important, because then we can make our own chronocloth gear. And especially if you're a warlock, like personally for me, tailoring is looking really, really appealing, along with alchemy. Inscription, though, again, also really tempting, because that's the Darkmoon decks. Historically very strong trinkets, and once you've created the Darkmoon deck that's strongest for you, you can then generate a lot of money early on by creating those Darkmoon decks for everybody else. You've then also got the consumable makers, so blacksmithing can make the sharpening stones, leatherworkers, engineers can make ammunition, which is basically like Shadowcore oil but for hunters and things like that. One of the ammos that can be made is essentially a AoE ammo, so it applies a little bit of AoE damage to everything, and they're kind of your options as a solo player. My recommendation, if you're a clothy, would probably be to have a mix of alchemy, inscription, and tailoring. But do remember that from a non-assigned craft perspective or from a solo player perspective, you do have access to work orders. So whatever you don't shore yourself up on, you will be able to access through work orders in the auction house as well. So don't worry too much about that. The whole bind on pickup thing isn't as relevant as it once was when it comes to crafting gear because of the work order system. So to summarize all of this then, because I appreciate that this is getting to nearly the 30-minute mark. The changes to the professions as a whole isn't as huge and hasn't really diminished the importance of some professions like alchemy and cooking, with them still being a massively intrinsic part of raiding. But from a personal level and from a player perspective looking in that doesn't necessarily have to worry about 30 other players, it's actually opened the doors up a lot in terms of how you want to play and what you actually want from your professions. If you want to make a buttload of money, go double gathering, or go enchanting, or alchemy, or whatever you want. Because the other side of this as well is a lot of the profession system now is based around whether or not you want professions to be your main or a main pillar of your time playing World of Warcraft. If you can't spend a lot of time crafting, don't worry about it. You might lose a gear piece here or there as a result, but you're not going to have to kill yourself over it. Hopefully, this video has helped you wrap your head around professions, how they've changed, what they've done, and kind of what the goal is. And if you've liked the video, please do hit me up with a subscribe. If not, comment below, let me know why. And I will see you all in the next one. Take care, folks, and have a good one.